After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabited its galaxy. But these were not the stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to that saga. George Lucas, from the introduction of A Splinters of the Mind's Eye, 1996.
Welcome back to the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view. I'm your host, Dormammu, and today we're stepping away from the senatorial debates, Jedi politics, and pod racing scandals to take a long, hard look at the galaxy's most famous man in Mandalorian armor. That's right, we're talking about Jango Fett, and more specifically, the Dark Horse comic series Jango Fett Open Seasons. Now, when we meet Jango in Attack of the Clones, he's a man of very few words. Just a paycheck, a jetpack, and a very talented son. Or, well, clone. But beneath that stoic helmet is a story of war, survival, and betrayal that stretches back decades before the Clone Wars ever began. Open Seasons takes us there. It's Jango's origin story, his Mandalorian heritage, and the chain of events that turned a farm boy from Concord Dawn into the genetic template for an army that would change galactic history. This isn't just another bounty hunter tale. This is a Mandalorian war story soaked in blood and honor codes, where political ideas clash just as violently as blaster bolts. It's also one of the EU's earliest and most influential explorations of Mandalorian culture, long before the days of Din Djarin and Grogu made "this is the way" a household phrase. Back then, if you wanted to understand Mandalorians, you started with Jango Fett, and Open Seasons was the essential text. So in this episode, we're going to explore how Open Seasons paints Jango's journey, from tragedy and loss, to mentorship under Jaster Mereel, to the bloody feud with the Death Watch, and ultimately to his fateful recruitment by Count Dooku. Along the way, we'll talk about the comic's tone, themes, and how it reframed Mandalorians as more than just armored mercenaries. They become a people, a philosophy, and in Jango's case, the seed of an entire galactic conflict. Strap in, because today's episode is going to be less about Jedi negotiations and more about survival, betrayal, and the brutal calculus of war. And, of course, about the man who would one day call the Kaminoans' cloning labs home. Jango Fett Open Seasons was published in 2002 by Dark Horse Comics, written by Hayden Blackman, with art by Ramon F. Box. Its release wasn't random timing. This was the era of Attack of the Clones, when suddenly Star Wars fans had a shiny new bounty hunter to obsess over. Boba Fett's mystique had already carried the fandom for decades, and George Lucas decided to raise the stakes by introducing his father. But the film only gave us a few clues. Jango was a bounty hunter, he wore Mandalorian armor, and Count Dooku had chosen him as the genetic blueprint for the Republic's clone army. Beyond that, he was still an enigma. Dark Horse was tasked with filling in those blanks, and Open Seasons was their answer. This 4-issue miniseries digs into Jango's past, revealing his origins on the planet Concord Dawn, his indoctrination into Mandalorian war culture, and the bloody conflicts that forged him into the hardened man we meet in the film. In doing so, the comic didn't just expand Jango's backstory, It defined Mandalorian culture in the expanded universe for years to come. As for the timeline, Open Season spans several decades. It begins more than 30 years before the events of Attack of the Clones, showing Jango as a young boy during a Mandalorian civil war. We watch him grow into a battle-hardened warrior under the mentorship of Jaster Mereel, survive betrayals and massacres, and finally come face to face with the Sith Lord who would offer him the deal of a lifetime. By the end of the story, we're standing on the very threshold of Episode 2, watching Dooku recruit Jango to become the template for the clone army. In short, this series isn't just a prequel, it's connective tissue. It explains why Jango was the perfect candidate for the job, how the Mandalorian legacy shaped him, and why his personal history with war and loyalty would ripple outward into the fate of the galaxy. For many years before Disney-era canon rewrote Mandalorian history with the Clone Wars and later The Mandalorian, Open Seasons was the definitive word on Jango Fett's past. It's the story that gave him depth beyond the helmet. At its heart, Open Seasons is a character study wrapped inside a war chronicle. While blasters, jetpacks, and flamethrowers tend to steal the spotlight, the real story is about individuals and the choices they make in a galaxy that has very little mercy. Jango is our central figure. When the story begins, he's just a farm boy on Concord Dawn, living a quiet life with his family. That peace doesn't last long. War comes crashing down, and Jango is forced to grow up very quickly. What makes Jango compelling here isn't simply the tragedy of his loss, but how he channels it. Instead of crumbling, he learns discipline, survival, and the Mandalorian code of honor. By the end of the comic, he's no longer just a soldier. He's the Mandalorian survivor. Jango becomes the embodiment of resilience, shaped as much by betrayal as by loyalty. Every origin needs a mentor, and for Jango, that figure is Jaster Mereel, leader of the true Mandalorians. He represents a more noble, principled vision of what Mandalorian culture can be. Disciplined warriors who live by codes of honor rather than unchecked savagery. Jaster takes Jango under his wing, becoming kind of a surrogate father after Jango loses his own. His influence looms large even after his death, guiding Jango's sense of identity. Without Jaster, there is no Jango Fett as we know him. The antagonist in the story and Jaster's rival, Tor Vizsla, leads the Death Watch, a splinter group that rejects Jaster's ideals in favor of violence, domination, and terror. Where Jaster sees honor, Vizsla sees power. He's the chaos to Jaster's order, and his feud with the true Mandalorian spills across the galaxy, consuming everything in its path, including Jango's family. Vizsla is ruthless, manipulative, and a reminder that Mandalorian culture has never been monolithic. It's always been a battleground of ideals. Jango's parents and sister appear only briefly, but their role is vital. They're the grounding force that shows Jango is more than just a soldier in training. He's a son and a brother. Their deaths are the spark that pushes him onto the Mandalorian path. In many ways, their loss is the defining wound of his life, the thing that makes him so guarded, so distrustful, and ultimately so dangerous. Count Dooku also frames the story, each chapter where he finds out more of Jango's tragic past. He doesn't care about Jango's personal tragedies or the Mandalorian code. He sees only a warrior of unmatched skill and resilience. To him, Jango is the perfect instrument, the ideal template for the Republic's future army. Their meeting is brief, but it's a pivot point because Jango steps out of the Mandalorian War and into galactic history. Altogether, these characters form the backbone of Open Seasons. They're more than just players in Jango's life. They embody the competing values of honor, chaos, loyalty, and manipulation that's shaped not just him, but the entire legacy of Mandalorian culture in the expanded universe. The story of Jango Fett Open Seasons begins far from Kamino's sterile cloning chambers. It opens instead on the agrarian world of Concord Dawn, where young Jango lives a quiet life with his family. Their land is peaceful, their existence humble, and therefore, in Star Wars tradition, doomed. The Mandalorian civil war raging between the honorable true Mandalorians and the extremist Death Watch comes to Jango's doorstep. When Tor Vizsla and his Death Watch raiders attack, Jango's family is caught in the crossfire. His parents are brutally killed, and his sister disappears, her fate left chillingly ambiguous. The boy who once worked fields with his father now stands amid their ashes. Enter Jaster Mereel, leader of the true Mandalorians. He sees potential in Jango, not just anger, but resilience, a spark of discipline. Jaster takes him in, training him as one of their own. Under Jaster's mentorship, Jango grows into a warrior. For a time, it seems he has found a family again, bound not by blood, but by armor and creed. But peace is fleeting. The feud between Jaster's true Mandalorians and Vizsla's Death Watch escalates, dragging Jango into campaigns across the galaxy. Betrayal cuts deeper than blasters. Jaster himself is betrayed and killed, leaving Jango to rise as the new Mandalore, the leader of his people. It's a position of immense honor, and an immense target on his back. The cycle of war ends in a massacre. On the world of Galadron, the true Mandalorians are lured into a trap. Jedi, manipulated into intervening, slaughter nearly all of Jango's warriors. Imagine that, Jango's brothers in arms cut down not by Vizsla alone, but by the supposedly noble Jedi Order. It's the kind of betrayal that brands itself into memory. Jango is captured, sold into slavery, and left to rot. But Jango Fett is not a man who stays caged. He fights his way back to freedom, emerging leaner, harder, and utterly alone. By the time Count Dooku arrives, cloaked in Sith designs, Jango is a survivor forged in war. Dooku offers him a deal to become the genetic template for a clone army, in exchange for wealth and a son of his own to raise. Jango accepts, sealing not only his fate, but the galaxy's. Open Seasons carries a tone that's equal parts war chronicle and tragedy. This is not a lighthearted adventure or even a traditional bounty hunter romp. The comic leans into grit, battlefield soaked in betrayal, the cold reality of survival, and the moral ambiguity of warriors who live by codes in a galaxy that doesn't respect them. It's brutal and often bleak, but that bleakness is the point. Jango's world is one where loyalty is tested, honor is exploited, and survival is a victory in itself. The narrative also has an almost mythic tone, as if it's recounting the rise of a legendary figure. Every triumph is shadowed by loss, every gain paid for in blood. It feels less like a hero's journey and more like a warrior saga, the kind sung by Mandalorian clans around a fire. Jango's story is a study in survival. From farm boy to orphan, from soldier to Mandalore, from slave to bounty hunter, his life is one long act of endurance. The theme of resilience is central. Jango survives not because fate is kind, but because he refuses to break. Again and again, Jango learns that loyalty comes at a cost. His loyalty to Jaster shapes him, but betrayal at Galadron destroys everything he built. His mistrust of the Jedi isn't born of prejudice, it's born of experience. The Mandalorian conflict is framed not as good guys versus bad guys, but as competing visions of Mandalorian identity. Jaster believes in honor and discipline. Vizsla believes in terror and domination. Jango, caught between these extremes, becomes the heir to their struggle. At its core, Open Season asks what it means to carry a legacy. Jango inherits Jaster's ideals, but twists them through his own lens of survival. And when he agrees to Dooku's offer, he ensures his legacy will stretch far beyond himself into millions of identical soldiers who will fight and die in his image. Finally, there's the tragic irony. Jango Fett, the man who fought so hard to stay free, becomes the unwilling father of an army men born into chains. His entire life is defined by fighting for freedom, yet his genetic legacy is servitude. The brilliance of Open Seasons is that it reframes Jango Fett. He's not just the quiet man with a jetpack from the films. He's a survivor of war, betrayal, and slavery, a man who fought for honor, but was consumed by the galaxy's endless cycle of violence. His story is less about bounty hunting and more about what it takes to endure when the galaxy itself seems determined to erase you. One of the great strengths of Jango Fett Open Seasons is how seamlessly it ties into both the prequel trilogy and the wider expanded universe. It doesn't feel like a side story. It feels like a missing chapter that slots perfectly into the larger saga. First, let's talk about its direct connection to the films. When we first met Jango in Attack of the Clones, he's already in Count Dooku's employ. He's mysterious, he's efficient, and he clearly has the respect of a Sith Lord. But the movie never tells us why. Open Seasons gives us that context. Dooku doesn't just pluck a random bounty hunter out of the galaxy. He chooses a man who has lived through war, commanded troops, survived betrayal by the Jedi, and proven himself unbreakable. Suddenly, Dooku's decision to entrust Jango with fathering an entire army makes perfect sense. Then there's the Mandalorian connection. Before this comic, Mandalorians were more of a tantalizing idea than a fully fleshed out culture. Sure, Boba Fett wore the armor, and there were bits and pieces in West End Games material, but Open Seasons gave us a war, rival factions, a code of honor, and names like Jaster Mereel and Death Watch that would echo throughout the extended universe storytelling for years. Later works, including Kieran Travis's Republic Commando novels, would take these seeds and grow them into entire Mandalorian subplots. Without Open Seasons, the Mandalorian resurgence in the extended universe simply doesn't happen the way it did. The comic also has ties to Cloak of Deception and Darth Maul Shadowhunter, two novels we've already discussed on this podcast. In those stories, we see Count Dooku and Darth Sidious manipulating galactic events behind the curtain, laying the groundwork for the Clone Wars. Open Seasons shows us that same manipulation on a smaller, more personal scale. Galadriel, the massacre of the true Mandalorians, is orchestrated with Sith-like precision, and it echoes the themes of corruption, control, and engineered conflict that dominate the prequel-era expanded universe. There is also the tragic irony that connects Jango's story to the Clone Wars novels and comics that would follow. Jango, the man who once fought for freedom against overwhelming odds, becomes the unwilling father of millions bred for servitude. The Republic Commando books, in particular, explore how the clones wrestle with identity, loyalty, and the meaning of brotherhood, questions that trace directly back to Jango's life under Jaster Mereel. His legacy becomes the clones' inheritance. Finally, Open Seasons casts a long shadow over the Fett name itself. When we later revisit Boba Fett in the expanded universe works like the Bounty Hunter Wars or even post-Return of the Jedi novels, the idea of Boba as a man caught between inheritance and identity gains new weight. He isn't just wearing armor because it looks cool. He's living out a cultural legacy defined by blood and war. That sense of lineage starts here in Open Seasons. In short, Jango Fett Open Seasons doesn't just tell us where Jango came from. It stitches him into the larger fabric of the saga, as a victim of Jedi betrayal, as the chosen hand of the Sith, as the cultural heir of the Mandalorians, and as the unwitting father of an army that would bring down the Republic. It's not just backstory, it's a keystone. Jango Fett Open Seasons is one of those expanded universe stories that does a deceptively simple thing. It takes a character we thought we knew and shows us we didn't know him at all. Before this comic, Jango Fett was just Boba Fett's genetic blueprint, a man in cool armor who died in a Sarlacc-adjacent pratfall in Attack of the Clones. But by the time you finish Open Seasons, he feels less like a background bounty hunter and more like a tragic war-forged figure who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the saga's greatest warriors. What makes the story memorable isn't simply its action, though it delivers plenty of jetpack combat and battlefield drama. It's the way it reframes Jango's entire life as a struggle against forces larger than himself. The chaos of Mandalorian civil war, betrayal at the hands of Jedi, enslavement, and finally manipulation by the Sith. Jango is a survivor, yes, but he's also a man who repeatedly loses everything he builds. That sense of tragedy inevitably lingers long after the final page. The comic also redefined Mandalorians for an entire generation of fans. It was the first expanded universe work to give them a culture, factions, rival philosophies, and a proper civil war. The names Jaster Mereel, Death Watch, and Mandalore would ripple through later stories, from the Republic Commando novels to Boba Fett's post-Return of the Jedi arc. Even if later canon reshaped Mandalorian history in the Clone Wars and The Mandalorian, much of the groundwork was laid here. And then there's the irony of Jango's legacy. He fought so hard for his freedom, only to leave behind an army bred for servitude. He built his identity around honor and resilience, only to have his likeness mass-produced for galactic war. His personal story is tragic, his legacy galactic in scale. That duality is what elevates Open Seasons from a tie-in comic to a mythic tale in its own right. In the end, Open Seasons isn't just a prequel to Attack of the Clones. It's a war story, a cultural history, and a tragedy all wrapped into one. It asks what it means to carry a legacy and whether survival alone is victory. And for Jango Fett, the answer is complicated, but unforgettable. And that brings us to the end of Jango Fett Open Seasons. What began as a tie-in comic meant to explain why Count Dooku hired Jango Fett ultimately became one of the expanded universe's most important explorations of Mandalorian culture. It gave us tragedy, loyalty, betrayal, and a man whose very survival altered galactic history. Jango's story is a reminder that even in the background of the saga, there are characters whose struggles carry the weight of legends. Next time, we'll be stepping away from the battlefields of Mandalorian wars and into something very different. A story of Jedi, strange planets, and visions of the future. We'll be taking a deep dive into Greg Bear's Rogue Planet, a novel that pairs a young Anakin Skywalker with his master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and sets them on a journey to a living world called Zonama Sekat. It's a book filled with mysteries, foreshadowing, and in hindsight, some startling connections to the new Jedi Order era. So if today's episode was about war and survival, our next one will be about destiny, growth, and the seeds of a galactic future that not even the Jedi could predict. Join us as we unravel Rogue Planet and see how an unassuming novel in the early prequel timeline planted some of the expanded universe's boldest ideas. Until then, I'm Dormammu, and this has been the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view. May the Force be with you.